Welcome back to the course, Cooperative Individualism, the third way to the just society. We are at lesson 11, titled The Democratic Imperative. In this next part of our discussions, we will examine the most important institutional changes and policy reforms consistent with the principles of cooperative individualism. In any society, peaceful changes require time for the generation of public education, interest, and support. That said, among those who today actively embrace cooperative individualism, there exists a real sense of urgency, a feeling that we may be running out of time. On the one hand, many reformers embraced programs associated with social democracy as the late 19th century came to an end. The scope of programs and policy proposals expanded incrementally, then accelerated after the Second World War. Reformers saw in the ideals of social democracy the great hope for the masses of people struggling to survive under the rule of hierarchical elites. An important influence on the development of social democracy was the German theorist Edward Bernstein. He firmly believed systemic reform could be achieved by peaceful means through incremental legislative measures. Many internal and external factors combined to intensify the role of government in social and economic matters previously regarded by the enemies of hereditary power as belonging in the realm of private affairs and sanctioned by the doctrine of laissez-faire. The experience of deep economic depressions, 2 world wars, and the threat of a 3rd world war provided the rationale for the growth in the size, scope, and cost of government. Note, however, that in the United States, the real growth in the number of people employed by government has occurred at the state and local levels. We have seen the grudging advance of the welfare state ever since, supported and thwarted on a policy-by-policy basis by individuals who profess to hold either conservative or progressive principles. To a significant extent, however, the political struggle has been one of who holds power over the division of the spoils. At and beyond the fringe of our present political parties, we find the countless grassroots and citizen-based groups whose members tend not to identify with either of the 2 main parties. Here are also found many of those who also belong to alternative political movements and parties such as the Libertarians and Greens. Thus far, the programs advanced by these parties have not been sufficiently attractive to mount a competitive challenge in the electoral arena. And so we find ourselves troubled by seemingly unsolvable social, economic, environmental, health, educational, and political problems, with our elected representatives immersed in posturing to preserve their political longevity rather than engage synergistically to promote and protect the rights of constituents to access the goods necessary for a decent human existence. It seems that too many of those who seek public office do so for reasons other than a real desire to serve the public interest. For those of us who embrace a transnational value system, we believe our socio-political arrangements and institutions must reflect certain fundamental values. First, that they live up to much higher standards of participatory democracy. Second, inherently protect human rights, including an equal opportunity to access nature. Third, expand equality of opportunity, which, despite the view of Irving Kristol, is not guaranteed by democracy as democracy now exists. And fourth, secure and protect individual liberty, which requires the prevention of criminal license and the regulation of and compensation to society for economic licenses granted to individuals or entities. We'll now explore some of the specific changes in our societal organization consistent with the principles of cooperative individualism. One of the greatest hurdles human civilization has to overcome is the prevalence of nationalism, a force in human affairs that restricts and diminishes our interaction as global citizens. In many societies today, the problem is exacerbated by ethnocentric territorialism and by intolerance toward groups of individuals who do not share the same culture, religion, race, or language. Tragically, economic stagnation in the social democracies is providing a convenient source of strength to all of the worst forms of human rights violations. A successful campaign to purge nationalism from human relations requires a sustained effort, with education and activism focused on the subordination of nation-state sovereignty to transnational, that is, universal, standards of behavior consistent with the securing of human rights. The forging of a global movement to counter nationalistic tendencies is as yet in its infancy. At a personal level, one's attachment to one's own society as something separate and apart from other societies is a bond not easily set aside. As Albert Einstein observed, nationalism is an infantile disease. It is the measles of mankind, but far more deadly than measles. How many of us are truly ready, for example, to denounce the exclusivity inherent in the concept of nation-state citizenship in favor of rights based on global citizenship? In response to this question, we ought to debate the practical considerations of sanctioning a second level of citizenship based on human rights. Wholesale adoption of this reform would protect our liberty to travel and live wherever one may wish. Within the United States and most other federated republics, this dual level of citizenship has always existed, and to an extent we seldom express, has been responsible for a high level of mobility for generations of immigrants and their descendants. One important result has been the creation of a small number of societies unique in history that encourage common values in an environment of pluralism. To be sure, the process has been painful and not altogether successful. Controversy exists, however, over the assertion that an emphasis on individual rights as a central building block of government has assisted many individuals to overcome the bias and prejudice to which many minorities are subjected. Not everyone thinks of individual rights and human rights as identical. And yet history and our contemporary experience demonstrate the very strong correlation between freedom to migrate and justice. Societies from which large numbers of individuals wish to but are prevented from leaving will always be found to have oppressive socio-political arrangements and institutions. Privilege for the few is the characteristic readily apparent to the outsider. From the standpoint of human rights, the only legitimate reasons for restricting the movement of individuals from one part of the globe to another involve the health and safety of others. A person infected with a highly contagious or communicable disease would jeopardize the health of others and should be quarantined in some fashion. A person who has committed a crime against others must not only pay a proper debt to society, but must demonstrate rehabilitation before an unwary populace in another part of the world is exposed to such an individual. Absent these behavior-related issues, citizenship must protect our human right of equal access to the earth, the exercise of which is inherent in the right to migrate. Within the receiving societies, the presence of tensions or fears that new immigrants will compete for available employment opportunities or drive down wages or add to crime or the cost of government are warnings that a difference exists between these societies in degree only. None of these conditions would exist in a society characterized by real equality of opportunity, by actual cooperative individualism. A society whose socio-political arrangements and institutions are consistent with human rights, that secures equality of opportunity and maximizes individual liberty, will welcome immigrants as valued new producers and contributors. As a long-term objective, we must continually work for a new form of global governance. In order to overcome the intense ethnic, often tribal conflicts over territory, these groups must be encouraged to accept settlements reached under conditions of binding arbitration. Deep animosities and rivalries will not disappear quickly. Many groups continue to think of themselves as a people separate and distinct from others, sharing a history of external domination and oppression that drives a deeply rooted need for cultural independence and territorial sovereignty. Here, expediency is warranted in order to promote peaceful intercourse between peoples based on voluntary association. A global fund could be created, perhaps from rents collected from the leasing of the ocean floor for exploitation of minerals, or the auctioning of licenses to commercial fishing enterprises, to provide some level of compensation to those required to relocate and abandon physical property or dispose of their property under conditions that do not lend themselves to a sale under normal market conditions. Another element in the struggle to purge nationalism from our existence is to encourage large nation states to divide into much smaller states, so that no one state within a global confederation is dominant in terms of population, natural resources, or development of physical infrastructure. For those of us living in very large countries, this would present an opportunity to debate a more efficient construction of regional states, each eventually becoming a member state in the global confederation. We've now reached the end of Lesson 11.